And when the FBI showed up on scene with the National Guard, the sheriff was there saying, look, this is taking place in my county. I'm actually the supreme law enforcement officer here. And the FBI tried to have him arrested for impeding a federal investigation. And so he was somebody who was aware of the fact that David Koresh could have been taken practically at any time. If he were an actual menace to the local community, the sheriff could have arrested him. That's how they should have proceeded. It's also well understood by those who studied this whole tragedy that in the fall of 1992, months before the attack took place, there were ATF agents who were going around the local gun stores there in Waco and asking questions about purchases made by Koresh and some of the other people there in the Branch Davidian community. And one of them actually called up David Koresh and said, look, I've got a couple of people from the ATF here. They say there's some irregularities in your paperwork. Would you like to talk to them? And Koresh said, certainly, put them on the phone or have them come out here. Have them come out and take a look at my inventory. And they didn't want to cooperate. They were trying to fabricate a casus belli. They're trying to fabricate some kind of a rationale, some kind of a pretext for an attack on that community. And that's the same mindset that led us into Iraq. If you take a look at what happened in 2002, 2003, there were any one of a number of opportunities that presented themselves that could have been used to prevent the war, and the Bush administration studiously avoided taking advantage of any of them. There was actually an offer on the table being mediated by the Arab League for Saddam Hussein and his putrescent sons to abdicate their power in Iraq and leave. They were obviously looking for some kind of a payoff. They wanted to make sure that they were well taken care of materially. But if you were trying to find some way of avoiding a war, the offer was on the table. Uday Qusay and Saddam would have left. They would have left with probably a couple of $100 million in their bank accounts.
Which is a little less than what we've paid on this
venture so far. That's less than a week's worth of expenditure here. I mean, if you're talking just about material wealth, but if you're talking about the irreplaceable wealth of human lives, both Iraqi and American, that's a bargain, But what they would have gone, they would have left. The oil fields would have been managed by OPEC, and which isn't a good arrangement, but it's a better arrangement than what we have right now. And the Arab League would have supervised elections to set up a successor regime in Iraq. That's the offer that was turned down by the Bush administration. And of course, at the same time, you had George Bush talking out the side of his mouth about how basically they have to get out of town. Saddam and his sons have to get out of town. Well, they wanted to get out of town. They were asking for safe passage and a couple of other considerations. And it was the Bush administration's intransigence that led to that war, in the same way that it was the intransigence of the ATF under the first George Bush and then under Bill Clinton that led to the assault on the Branch Davidian commune in 1993. And once again, the behavior of the government that rules us is consistent here with respect to both foreign and domestic policy. When it decides it's going to make war on innocent people, all bets are off, the safeties come off, and there are no limits to the depths they're willing to descend.
That's very interesting, and I want to come back and talk to that a little bit more. And one thought I had when you were sharing about when our enemy is our own government is the fact they have an extra tool in their tool chest, is that they can disguise themselves by setting up other enemies that are the presumed enemy of the public, and that's an extra tool they have that many of our overseas enemy may not have at their disposal. And I want to go back and just bring some closure to this original question I asked you about evangelicalism, and I'm treading on very careful ground here, sort of a minefield, but I would say that what you just shared in the last few minutes is something that many God-loving evangelical Christians were totally unaware of. And partially it is an issue of education, at least for the large masses within this community. Right now, we see an environment where we're being sent a message in mass, quite a bit of expense paid to it, to tell Christians to vote for the lesser evil, and to basically side what's in the best big picture interest. When I hear that, I tend to think of in the Gospels when the religious leaders decided it was better to crucify Jesus for the better long-term interest of the religious state of the temple, and that it would not invoke the passions of the Romans. What do you think about those kind of thoughts, and what do you think is going to be the end result of that position, and is there a better alternative?
Well, first of all, what I like to say to people who talk about supporting the lesser of two evils is that the lesser of two evils isn't because that's the evil that gets done. People are always talking about avoiding the greater evil. Well, the greater evil in that analysis, and it's a form of sophistry, the greater evil in that analysis is never the one that is done. So it's entirely hypothetical. The tangible evil is always the lesser evil. That's the one people are told to choose. That's the one they select. So that's, by tangible definition, the greater evil, because the other one remains purely hypothetical. And here, of course, we're talking about the prospect of supporting John McCain rather than supporting Barack Obama. And I don't have any enthusiasm for either of these candidates. And just a couple of days ago, when I was on another Christian radio station, somebody called in and asked if it wouldn't be a good idea to support the Republican candidate, given the fact that we're talking about control of the Supreme Court and the fact that a Republican president would be in a position to make several key judicial nominations, including a couple of sitting justices of the Supreme Court. And I said, well, if you take a look at the record of Republican appointments to the Supreme Court, it really doesn't leave one suffused with confidence over the ability of Republicans to choose sound constitutionalists, because a lot of the precedents, I'm thinking specifically now of Roe versus Wade, the abortion precedent in 1973, for instance, a lot of these precedents involve decisions handed down by Republican-appointed judges, or judges themselves who are Republicans in terms of their previous political activism. If I'm not mistaken, I believe Earl Warren was a Republican, and it was the Earl Warren Court that's most notorious for judicial activism, at least in the minds of a lot of people. But you take a look at what's happened in more recent terms. The Republican-appointed judges in the Supreme Court just a couple of days ago, in a decision having to do with habeas corpus, which is the fundamental due process guarantee in Anglo-Saxon law, common law, is a habeas corpus. That means basically that you cannot be imprisoned indefinitely at the whim of an executive, that the government has to justify your imprisonment. Just a couple of days ago, the Supreme Court handed down a divided 5-4 ruling upholding the principle of habeas corpus as it applies to people who are accused of being unlawful enemy combatants and detained by the government at Guantanamo Bay or elsewhere. And the way that this worked out is you had a couple of, I guess you'd have to call them moderate Republican appointees, Souter being one of them, who were in the 5-4 majority, and then the 4 hardline conservatives of the sort that John McCain would appoint were the 4 justice minority, saying in essence that habeas corpus is something that can be considered disposable in the interest of fighting the so-called war on terror. So you actually have 4 Republican judges, the hardline so-called conservative judges of the sort that John McCain says would be the template for his appointments, who would dispose of a key due process guarantee that's been foundational to the Anglo-Saxon concept of liberty under law since 1215. Now, that's the greater evil by any definition if you're talking about the judicial appointment aspect of the presidential campaign. Now, when you talk about the idea that the evangelical church, the leadership of the evangelical church has placed itself in a position of being apologists for the regime in the interest of maintaining their seat at the table, I think that's a good analysis. It's very provocative but very useful to take a look at the way that the religious leadership in Palestine at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, how they comported themselves, talking about the need to make this expedient sacrifice of one man rather than to have the entire nation perish in the retribution that would be visited upon them by the Romans. That's a pretty good example, I think. I think that might be the definitive example of the seat at the table fallacy, where people have to attenuate their commitment to principle in order to retain their given position, and how this is supposedly the best of all possible arrangements. There was a time in the history of our country, and it wasn't that terribly long ago, when the Christian church would sit in judgment of the conduct of our government with respect to, among other things, matters of war and peace. You can go back and read some wonderful sermons from the mid-19th century where the leaders of what we now call the Baptist Church, for instance, would say that warfare is an unmitigated evil when it's not being carried out for purposes that are consonant with Christian principle. And this all changed in the late 19th, early 20th century as the social gospel metastasized into a fighting faith where people were treating the state as an instrument of God's will in the world. There's a wonderful book by Richard Gamble called The War for Righteousness, which talks about how it was what we now call progressive or liberal Christianity that first brought about this commingling of the state in the war fighting capacity with the evangelical Christian church. I mean, this became so blatant and so obvious by the beginning of World War I that you actually had these hymns to the divine glory of the state being published in magazines like the Christian Century. I mean, one of them actually published a poem, the final couplet of which said something to the effect that the making of man is the job of the state. I'm trying to figure out how anybody professing to be a Christian could believe that sentiment. You know, the making of man both as an individual created in God's image and in the redemption of his immortal soul is certainly not the job of the state. I mean, that's God's affair. Mm-hmm. But, you know, we're living now over a century later with the aftermath of this illicit union, I think, and it's grown tighter and firmer under the reign of George W. Bush because people in the evangelical leadership seem to assume that he is one of us because he speaks the potted pious platitudes of megachurch sermons in at random times when it's politically convenient for him to do so, and then he proceeds to govern as if none of these things make any sense or have any impact on his decisions.
Well, that's amazing that you bring that up. What you were talking about, the compromises in as far as the state and the incestuous relationship with the church, reminds me much of what Dr. Erwin Lutzer talks about in his book Hitler's Cross, on what happened to the evangelical church in the early days of the Nazi Empire prior to World War II. They very formalized that position, and it created a crisis within the evangelical community itself. You know, I want to make clear to my listeners that this is not a session to beat up on John McCain or the right wing. The issues of the left have not come up right now because we clearly know we have another major candidate that strongly believes in the wholesale slaughter of children in the womb under our own discretion here on our own shores, as opposed to other shores, and a host of other issues that we would find completely unacceptable. And I think as we get to the whole concept of talking of Christian libertarianism, it becomes very clear that going farther left is not the solution to the problems that we have in our country. But I have been seeing emerging a third way. And this third way, which we've tried to document on our show since we've been on the air the last few years, sort of relates to an observation I've made. I often hear, particularly from young people, who in fact we have a large quotient of them that are Future Quake fans, that support liberty and support other constitutional efforts like Ron Paul's campaign, for example,
Sure.
that phenomena. Many of those people are agnostics or atheists. They perceive evangelical right-wing Christians in a way that I can only describe in general as being oppressors rather than liberators, and that's sort of my summary term. In defending, they're perceived as defending the powerful and exploitative and trying to force their individual personal morality and standards of private conduct coercively on all Americans by the use of the courts and legislature, or at least that's their intent. Some of that characterization may be a mere minimally informed stereotype that they're imposing on us,
Sure.
to be fair. But there's still much of a ring of truth to it, I find. Some in the community, like for example, a Constitution Party presidential candidate, Pastor Chuck Baldwin, and I'll include myself and others, perceive that we have missed an opportunity to reach a generation by appearing to them as hateful, arrogant, and uncompassionate, and focusing only on doctrine and words and not in actions, even though doctrine is obviously critically important, and not providing leadership in the community by being our brother's keepers and championing the oppressed in light of God's Word. I feel this perception is likely inhibiting our ability in these days to fulfill the Great Commission to our generation. What do you think of this perception as I've described it, and how would you describe our perception as evangelicals by society today?